on. Don't worry. Continue your program. Oh boy, it's really something super fantastic here. You couldn't ever imagine this. Roger. We know about that. Could you go the other way? Go back the other way.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to world's biggest digital space conference, the Global Space Summit 2021, organized by SDNx and Helium Learning Lab. Space is an inspirational concept that allows you to dream big. Those big dreams about space has made us gather here. I'm Amrita, an intern at Helium Learning Lab, and your host for this section. SDNx Foundation was established in the year 2013 with the purpose of making space accessible to everyone. Through its initiatives and educational projects supported by Space Research and Development, Helium Learning Labs, our organizing partner, and the EdTech company that aims to establish a world-class digital space school to fill the gap between space education and space industry, to train students for the future space workforce. Our theme for this year, the role of space education and research in emerging nations, was adopted to put a spotlight on space activities in emerging nations and empower them further. We expect that through this summit, the young students and young space professionals can get guidance with their education and career. With a similar motive, for the next space generation of New Zealand, we have Chen. He is a space biologist researching in the effects of microgravity on particular bacteria at Te Punahate, the Space Institute. He is a co-national point of contact for New Zealand and committee member at the Space Medicine and Life Science Project Group at Space Generation Advisory Council. Welcome, Yankai. Now the stage is all yours. You can present now. Over to you, Yankai.
Oh yeah, just let me share my screen. All right. Do you see my slides or notes?
Yes. Yeah, you
Okay.
can continue.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So hey everyone, my name is Yan Kai, and I'm currently doing a Masters of Science at the Space Institute at the University of Auckland. And yeah, so today I'll be talking about like how I got to where I am, and I'll briefly talk about the space industry and academia in New Zealand, as well as some of the SGAC activities we're conducting here. And so I'm originally from Taiwan, and I moved to New Zealand when I was 7. And so I've done primary, secondary, and tertiary education here in Auckland. So in some way, you can say I'm a product of New Zealand's educational system, or despite of it. And so in high school, a friend of mine and I wanted to become astronomers. So we would visit the local star dome. And so visiting the local star dome was good because you got to see how people... Wait, hold on. Wait, am I sharing my notes as well? No, okay. Visiting the star dome was good because you got to see how people operated the observatory and what kind of work you expect to do at the observatory. But while it was enjoyable to look at planets and their moons, but it was also at this point I asked myself whether this was really for me. And at university, I ended up doing biology because I watched too much Jurassic Park actually, and I talked to a genetics professor quite a lot, and it was at that point, when I understood there's quite a lot of complications if you're trying to bring back the dinosaurs. And during postgrad, my interest in the space sector came back, and I had requested to write some essay topics in space biology. And so originally I had considered to go overseas, but after writing some assignments in space biology, I realized that this area can be in fact done in New Zealand. And after a couple of rejections, I was able to secure supervisors to support me in this area of research, which is what I'm working on in my master's. So it isn't a requirement to go overseas to get into this field. And particularly if you don't want to be a cog in a machine, starting a new field feels pretty good. And I wanted to quickly talk about the factors driving space in New Zealand. And so New Zealand isn't traditionally a space player. And most of this comes down to costs. Technological improvements in smaller electronic components means that there's a reduction in size and cost for making and launching satellites. And this reduction in cost means that it's possible for businesses to get into space. You no longer need large monetary input from the government, which essentially means that you no longer needed to live in a big economy to be in the space sector. Space is very much about advanced technology, and this has implications on national prestige. So I wouldn't say that there's no politics involved, but it is less political. But also appetite. The talents, there are a lot of talents that want to be in the space sector, and now the capital requirements to get into the space sector is not as much as before. So the New Zealand Space Agency was established in 2016, and this was done under the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. So it's not its own thing. So it's not its own agency, really. And it mostly handles policy and regulation, such as licensing for launches for Rocket Lab. And we prefer not to have expensive programs. But we still contributed towards Methane Sat, which is a 26 million program. And it's used to monitor climate change, as climate change is very much a part of New Zealand's policy. We drained the Artemis Accords in June of this year, and this will allow our space companies to get into the Artemis program. For space academia, most of this is done in University of Auckland in the north, Victoria University of Wellington in center, as well as Canterbury University in Christchurch in the South Island. And we already have a mixture of traditional space sector, such as meteorite analysis, solar wind, and astrobiology. But with new space, we also have small satellites, micropropulsion, sensors, and space biology. And so since I'm in the University of Auckland, I'll talk a bit about academia here at the University of Auckland. And this year we started a Masters of Aerospace Engineering, which looks at aerospace designs, mechanisms, and also a research project, hopefully in your area of interest. But it also gives formal qualifications for people interested in going to the space sector. Te o Marama is the Maori description for the natural world. And this is essentially, Te o Marama essentially looks at astrobiology, so this could be looking at rocks and hot springs, which would be done down in Rotorua. And then there's also the Auckland Program for Space System. So APSS is a program that allows undergraduate students to propose a small satellite mission, and the winning team gets their satellite sent up to orbit. And just this year, and recently, we got to send our first university student-made satellite to orbit. And it's not just that. This program, a lot of the time in this program, students propose business ideas. And so in this program, we've generated a couple of space startups from the University of Auckland. With commercial aerospace, I'll start off by talking about Rocket Lab, and because Rocket Lab is most popular and most well known. And so Rocket Lab has Electron, the Electron rocket, which is meant to send small payloads to low Earth orbit. And there's also a mission to shoot payloads to the moon. But we're also quite interested in sending a small satellite to Venus. Neutron is currently in development and it's meant to send much larger payloads. And it's also meant to be able to carry humans. But it is a bit unfortunate the Neutron won't be built in New Zealand. The Photon is a kick stage and it's really meant to help push satellites to desired orbits. And there's also a mission to send Photon satellites to Mars. And so I've used the aerospace term rather than just space is because in New Zealand it's not just about rockets. It's also about space planes as well. And so we have the Kia Atmos, which is meant to fly months at a time and looking at high resolution monitoring and data exchange. And then there's also the Mark II Aurora from Dawn Aerospace, and it's looking at delivering suborbital payloads. And we also have, a more classical observation and communication. So Kiwi Star Optics makes space lenses. And then there's Aurora Ground Station. So that's for communication, as well as Zera, which is an Earth observation down in the South Island. And so what is SGAC? Or what's the Space Generation Advisory Council? To sum it up, it is a non-governmental organization that serves as a platform to connect university and young professionals in the space sector, regardless of where you are. And in SGAC, you have project groups such as law and policy, sustainability, space medicine and life science, and others as well. And in SGAC, you can have up to 2 points of contact per nation. And as one of the national point of contact, you naturally want to understand what's happening in the country. And it's actually with understanding we came up with some initiatives. And so for our international audience, Aotearoa is the Maori description for New Zealand. And so on the surface, Go Space Aotearoa was a offline hybrid online event meant to encourage New Zealanders to the space sector. But the reason we did this was after investigating the space sector in New Zealand, we noticed that the different regions in New Zealand were doing their own things. Having no national space plan also means that the different regions were doing their own things because the state didn't really set up any infrastructure. They're just there for regulations and policy. And so one of our main goals in Go Space Aotearoa was to connect the different regions together. And we did this by partnering up with local organizations such as Space Base down in Christchurch, as well as the New Zealand Space Student Association in Wellington. And the other thing is, so New Zealand is an isolated set of islands. So one thing I wanted to make sure is that New Zealand is represented at international events. Kiwis or New Zealanders need international experience. as well as ways to make themselves attractive to employers. So upskilling is absolutely part of the goal. And an example of this is the Singapore Space Challenge. I was passing this event around, and the New Zealand Space Student Association picked it up and arranged a team. And to our surprise, even though we just sent there for representation, the New Zealand team ended up winning the grand prize at the competition. And so we do have well-educated talents here in New Zealand. The one thing that did bug me was that we couldn't find any Aucklanders for this team. And it was from this, we decided to create the club Space Generation Auckland. So SGA is a club I founded at the University of Auckland. And our main aim is to foster a space community, equip students with knowledge, and connect them to opportunities in the space sector. And it was actually through SGA, we got a team to compete in the Kibo Robot Programming Challenge. And this team is currently the national team. So a couple of teams across New Zealand competed in the Kibo Challenge. But our team is the team at the University of Auckland is currently the national team. And really what I'm trying to say is Auckland is the most populated city here in New Zealand. We have a lot of talents, but talents are nothing if we don't make use of them. So I have a number of friends working in Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and also studying at MIT. But what they're not doing is helping Auckland and New Zealand become a better place. I thought I just let everyone indulge in this piece of art I made when I was designing a logo for space for the club. Wanted to make it a uniquely Kiwi design. This isn't the final logo, by the way. So to understand New Zealand has a high dependence on East Asia for trading. And through Rocket Lab, we have a high dependence on the United States in our space sector. And I don't know how others view this, but to me, it's strategic vulnerability. And this vulnerability means that we must diversify. And so geographically, Southeast Asia are our neighbors, but we don't give them enough attention. The Southeast Initiative and the broader Southeast are terms I completely made up. But the broader Southeast, I think, makes sense if you view Oceania or Australia and New Zealand as an extension of Southeast Asia. The great thing is that you get to remove Asia out of the term. And so the Southeast Initiative is to foster understanding and relations between the nations of the broader Southeast. Does this mean that Southeast Asia wants better relations with New Zealand? Absolutely not. But we have to start conversations somewhere to see how their interest aligns with ours. New Zealand's security relies on an open South Pacific. Across the Pacific reside many Pacific Island nations. Their sovereignty is deeply tied to New Zealand's interests. It is our interest to make sure that Pacific Island nations maintain a relationship of good values and have maritime rights. New Zealand's space sector should be of good influence to the Pacific Islands. But where do we start? And we start by fostering interest in the Pacific, space interest in the Pacific. But it's difficult to find Pacific Islanders in the space sector. But we do have a lot of people of Pacific Island descent here in Auckland. In fact, Auckland is the Pacific capital of the world. We have more people of Pacific Island descent than Pacific Islands. And so we can start by bringing Pacific Island students into the space sector here in Auckland and New Zealand, and then they can leverage their connections to the Pacific Islands. But in summary, so space is a new and exciting. There won't be an expensive space program here in New Zealand, but this and also no national programs. So this does leave room for private players to build space business, as well as local players to build space communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian Hai, for the insight to New Zealand space sector. Allow me to go ahead with the interview section. My first question is, New Zealand is in atomic accords. Would New Zealand be interested in international research lunar station?
Okay, so I think the best way to look at it is actually to think about, so what's actually happening down here in New Zealand is a lot of the space academia also haven't really talked about is that the space academia is actually looking at the commercial side. So a lot of them is going to commercial and also building infrastructure. And with the International Lunar Research Station, or the ILRS, is that it's also infrastructures. And this kind of puts IRLS and New Zealand companies in, I guess, a bit of a competition, because we're looking to provide infrastructures to launch payloads, which is what IRLS is also looking to. And because we don't actually have any, we don't have expensive programs, and if we do, if the government does end up coughing up, many millions of dollars or billions of dollars to have a big space program launch in IRS, that's getting a bit political in my opinion. But otherwise, unless the nations of ILRS are looking to send payloads here from New Zealand, I don't think there's actually too much room for us to go in. So it's looking at, does it work for us? So are there places where our interests align?
Okay. So, what kind of space startup are you most excited in your country? What kind of space startups are you most excited in your country? In your opinion,
I
how
guess.
does space private? Okay, can I complete my question?
Oh yeah, go
Yeah.
for it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, in your opinion, how does the space privatization support the development of space ecosystem?
Okay, I guess with the first question, I guess the most, I guess the startup that's currently that excites me would be Dawn Aerospace. So it is a space plane looking to deliver payloads. So we talked a lot about, so in the launch sector, it's all about providing rapid and also reusable access to space. But with rockets, you always have to launch it up, and sometimes you would discard the entire rocket, or you discard the half of the rocket, and so that's and then you have to spend more money on it and rebuild that portion of the rocket. And sometimes even if you retrieve it, you have to do a lot of refurbishing and retesting. And so that's kind of slow. But with space planes, the point of it is that you can launch it up to orbit, deliver your payload, get the space plane to land, put another payload, and go send it right back. And it's because space planes are under the regulation similar to airplanes. So airplanes, once it lands, some refueling, send it right back up. And so that's with space planes, that's also the similar case for it, is that you launch a space plane all the way to space. Once it lands back, you refuel it and you can launch it right back. And there's a lot less testing and refurbishing. Well, you don't really, a lot less testing and refurbishing required for spaceplanes. So that's so I would say Dawn Aerospace is probably what I'm most excited about. But currently their plane is looking at suborbital, and their Mark III will be looking at sending towards orbital payloads. So that's what I'm most interested about. And with your second question, how does the space privatization support the development of the space ecosystem? Is that I would say, so you have to think about the difference between government and also the private companies. Is that when say government space program, you're always trying to. It's a lot about the nations and the experiments or the national space program isn't necessarily sustainable. And with the private sector, the space business has to be sustainable from the very beginning. Otherwise, it wouldn't survive. And I think, and if your company is, basically, if with this private sector, if it's sustainable, then it is far more, at least I think it's a lot more supportive of developing a space ecosystem. Whereas a national program, you're subject to, I guess, what the government says is what's good or what should be developed for the nation. Because, at one point, the government might say, let's make a new rocket. But then later, you might change, the government might change due to elections. And so a certain program can be canceled. And and having programs canceled, I think, is really really bad for, I guess, for the people who were previously working in that program. So I would say privatization of space sector is quite useful in making sure that the space ecosystem is sustainable, and so it's a lot more. It's gonna last a lot longer. Yeah, that's what I have.
Yeah, I truly support that point. Like, okay, so moving to the next question. Since the space ecosystem is growing, what kind of collaborations can benefit emerging nations? Do you think collaborative work with a developed nation like United States and an emerging nation like Siberia can be beneficial?
Okay, so I think I guess we look at the New Zealand example or Rocket Lab. The collaboration with the United States it's useful mostly to do with like prior knowledge and direct monetary investment. So that's where I see it, because they have already an established community and established expertise. So that's quite useful for emerging nations. But with other emerging nations, I think because emerging space nations are usually, they don't have as much established infrastructure and established capitals and established infrastructure. Oh, basically, it's to do with infrastructure, and there can be collaborations because a particular nation might have launch capacity, but another nation might have a satellite that they like launch. And so in this case, there's a lot of the interest. Basically, there's a lot of interest that can align. And so I think when we're talking about collaborations between emerging space nations, it's about, okay, what are we missing, and how can we help others, or what do others want? So that's really how I see it. Is that it's looking at what's missing between the different emerging space nations.
True. Yeah, true. Yeah, as you said, space academia is going towards infrastructure. What's preventing more New Zealanders from purchasing education in space sector?
So I think you have to to bring more New Zealanders into the space sector or space education, you have to think about what the ordinary New Zealand student goes through. So you have to picture a student in New Zealand. So most students in New Zealand, when they a large amount of them won't actually ever go on to universities. And for those that do go into universities, a large proportion of them, particularly domestic students, is that they take on government loans. And every year we get reminded of how much debt we've incurred from starting at university. And so this debt builds up. And so by the time you finish your undergraduate degree, a lot of students are actually looking at how much debt they owe. And then so the first thing when you're looking at a large debt is that you want to pay back the loan. So a lot of time, I think this actually forces a good amount of student towards, well, this convinces a lot of student to go towards towards working, like basically getting a job that might not necessarily be in the space sector to help pay back the loan. And also, but usually you spend many years paying back the loans, and they might, get a family, have a family, or buy a house, which they'll have to keep on doing. And I think that's actually a big inhibitor for getting Kiwis to the space sector. And if we're looking at the education, usually this means, if you're looking at postgraduate study, this means, more loans, and even if you have a scholarship, usually the scholarship are, they're just enough to survive. They're not, you don't actually get to live well. So for a lot of students, pursuing space education isn't necessarily an attractive option in terms of their financial situation. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, as a last thing, what is the one advice that you would like to give the students and young persons who wants to work in space industry?
I guess with getting careers, it's all about connections and a lot about mindsets. So earlier I talked about a lot of students might look at their financial situations and then they just said, actually, I'm not gonna do this. But really, I guess you have to try and think past that. You have to, I guess, you kind of have to. You kind of just have to go along with it. If you really love the space sector, you have to. You do end up keep going along with it. But the other part is with connections, which is a lot to do with talking to people. So with how I got into studying a news, basically space biology here at the University of Auckland, is that you really had to talk to people. Not everyone's gonna trust you, but but it's about finding the right people and also learning these skills to convince people that that you are worth this. And basically convincing people and also having the mindset to persevere and keep going. And so that's I guess that's what my career advice is.
Yeah. Okay, once again, thank you, Yenkai, for your valuable time. Hope our work pays well and we have a bright future in space industry. I also want to add, please join us for tomorrow's session in the Global Space Summit at 8 p.m.
Oh, all right. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Okay, so think you will be the for tomorrow's section, won't you?
All right. All right. Just send me the links, and I'll try and get into it. Otherwise,
Yeah.
yeah.
So thank you, Yankai.
Thank you for having me, Amufra and Chen.